Well, it was a week of own goals and Owen Paterson for the Conservatives, and Boris Johnson's approval rating slumps to a record low, which you can never say of William Kedjanyi. Although, if you were actually subject to an approval rating, maybe it would be low, maybe it would be high. Today, it actually might be low, William Kedjanyi, as we report from your house. The polling station is back to its normal ways. You're not on location today. You're back home, and again sporting a Jon Snow-esque tie.
Yeah, this has to be the first in, I think, about 6 or 7 polling stations where I'm actually just at a normal residence, which I can claim to be at least, the owner of. So it's actually quite a weird feeling to be here. But have no fear for the travelling fans, because there are 2 by-elections coming up before Christmas. So we might be on our travels again soon.
Yeah, a lot of us get excited by Christmas. I was in a Vodafone store the other day where the teller wished the guy beside me happy Christmas, and I was a bit disgusted by this. What would it be, the 1st of November or something like that? But for William Kedjanyi, if you have 2 by-elections between now and Christmas, this actually genuinely is something to get very excited about. Now, let's talk Owen Paterson. This was just the latest disaster, really, for the Tories in terms of a bad few months. It's probably been a bad year in general for Boris Johnson. Scathing article in the Irish Times by Fintan O'Toole about him. I know you're a fan of Fintan O'Toole today, William. But the Owen Paterson affair, it could have been bad, but it was actually worse for Boris.
Yeah, and it's a huge political own goal on quite a few fronts, because if we imagine an alternate timeline in which they had just accepted that he had to be suspended for 30 days. They had taken the kick in the teeth and they had moved on. I imagine that sometime in January, or actually even probably within a week or so, I really just think it probably wouldn't have been that high in the public radar. I struggle to see it being a leading news story. It would have been embarrassing a bit, but he'd have kept his seat. I would have faded away. Now, of course, the government went, they vehemently defended him. They free-line whipped to basically tie, I think it's fair to say that they wanted to tie their proposed reforms of the parliamentary standard system, which would have given us a committee with a Tory majority, along with a defence of the Paterson case, which to me seems indefensible. And the report is very clear about that. That has basically led to the stories we've been seeing over the last few days or so, where MPs' second jobs are very much under the spotlight. And I think with fair reason, because there are a lot of MPs who are making a lot of money on top of their wage, which is £80,000 a year, far more than the average. It's over double, I think, the median wage. And I think even for a professional, 80 grand is not bad, considering also you get expenses, etc. So just as an example, before we move on, there was a list to think of 12 or so MPs who'd made £3.5 million over last year doing their second jobs. Geoffrey Cox is on the front page of the Daily Mail today. He was the Attorney General, very, very fine legal mind. But I think it's fair that people might ask what an MP is doing working for 141 hours a month. That's a full-time job in itself, and also getting £400,000 a year for it.
So in theory, this is good for Labour, bad for the Conservatives, yes or no?
Yes, in good for Labour in theory. It's playing out a bit like that in the polls so far, and we'll discuss that a bit more later, but actually Labour's having some of its best polling in quite a while. We've been talking about this. The gap has narrowed a bit. Now we've seen Labour take a lead with Ipsos Mori, really important poll, we'll dig into that later, and also they're just one behind with Redfield and Wilton. That's quite important because Redfield and Wilton have had the Conservatives much further ahead, I think second only to YouGov. And Labour also closing the gap even with YouGov. Well, actually, I say closing the gap. What's really happening is the Conservatives are falling behind.
Yeah.
And disaffected voters are leaving or showing their disgust.
Labour is give or take standing still.
Give or take pretty much standing still. But at this point, if this state of affairs was to hold, this is potentially, it would have to be repeated at a general election. So please don't put too much cast in my words, but it's potentially hung Parliament Starmer PM territory. if those results were to be repeated at a general election.
Well, it's also, you say it's not a general election, but there is a fairly common trajectory here in that the Conservatives are slipping because of various things just hitting them. And this was always going to be inevitable in the Boris-led administration. The man is an absolute idiot and things are going to go wrong. And if Keir Starmer literally does nothing, he's a good chance of being elected as Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing though, and the thing that just tempers sort of my overexcitability, as much as I love a good polling shift, is just that
you're a flip-flopping favourite man.
I'm a flip-flopping favourite man. Johnson has done this kind of stuff basically since he got in office. Even before he'd won the leadership election, he was doing this sort of stuff. Anybody who actually gave you sort of a unbiased and I think fair view of him would know that he is not really, well, he's not a governor. He's not a government man. He's a politician and a campaigner first. And when it comes to government, the trolley metaphor by Dominic Cummings, I think, is a fair example. He goes from disaster to disaster, lurches from screeching U-turns, etc. All those structural faults, I wouldn't argue they're beginning to come to the surface. I'd argue they've been there, but they're being exposed in a way, I think, that uniquely makes people across the political spectrum angry. A lot of these things have been picked up mainly by people who aren't in the Conservative voting camp. They are now, and I think that's showing through in some of the polls. Long story, or in the long term, I should say, the near to long term, there are two things I think which are important questions. Number one, is this part of a trend that had been taking place already, which is just being exaggerated by a story with Tory media focusing on the phase of the government? And number two, is there anything that the government can do to avert it? Because this is not the only thing they're losing ground on.
He did. I thought he had a fairly good week in terms of Glasgow, and his talk about. He obviously talks a good talk in pretty much in anything. But I thought his general kind of statements in relation to the climate and all that, I thought they were quite good, and I thought that might endear him to some voters. But at the moment, who would make the better PM? Boris 28%. He's down 5. Keir Starmer 26%, up 4, and that is the opinion. And that was 1,840 UK adults basically canvassed actually just the other day. The trajectory is obviously very favourable for Sir Keir Starmer. What is the latest betting on this? So there has to be a move here, because I've always thought all along that the Conservatives were far too short to win the next election. And now there may be a little bit of after time in there, but I have consistently said I think Boris is an absolute imbecile.
Yeah, you have, and to be fair, that is not an uncommon view inside or outside the world of political betting. The move we're seeing is on Johnson to go. It's not in the next election, it's on Johnson to go. I think this is right. Political punters following the sort of much vaunted Tory story of getting rid of leaders once they've served their use. And it was interesting because somebody told Newsnight's Nick Watt yesterday that Boris Johnson had two major tasks. One was to get Brexit done.
Which isn't going very well.
No, not going entirely swimmingly on either of our islands. But
not going entirely swimmingly, there's a euphemism.
True. But however badly that goes, they can probably count it in the dumb box. And the other was coronavirus, which again, listen, that is far from over. Far from over. But most Tory MPs, I think, and most Conservative members would consider the heavy lifting done with a vaccine now. And they would consider, I think, the virus to be endemic and not to be the only political calculation in a way it was sort of a year ago when we were talking about it. But after all that, a lot of MPs have been briefing basically that, as you say, he's an imbecile with no real use. And people are beginning to sort of cotton on to that. And Boris Johnson is 20 to 1 to go this year. Now, that won't happen, but I think that's a really good signifier of the sort of lack of faith.
I don't think you can ever say won't in politics. You know, 2 months can actually be a long time in politics, and something could happen. Who knows?
True. Something could happen. But I think structurally that's too difficult. But we've cut him for pretty much every single going option. He's now 7-4 not to be the Tory leader at the next election. That was from 2 to 1. We've been seeing interesting money for that. The 20s, I said earlier, was for 33s to go this year. He's 100 to 30 to go next year as well. and now the date of his latest exit has been moved. It's 2023 or later, and even then that's falls on, which is an unusual position, I think, even for a government with an 80-seat majority to be in. Now, I know we haven't seen that since like the third Blair premiership, but I think it's still worth bearing out.
Well, what does Keir Starmer do then? If you are sort of on the side of Labour in terms of, the next elections and you've taken a stance on Labour, what does he do in 2022 to galvanise a party that has been quite fractured as well? Because the opposition is in something of a turmoil.
I think, and this is me giving my personal advice, I think he's got to focus on his offer. He's got to focus on building an offer, and he's got to focus on building a narrative, and he needs to find people to sell.
Almost a simple narrative. Like let's not overcomplicate things.
Yeah, absolutely. He needs that. He needs, I think, other people in the shadow cabinet to step up to the plate as well. But my opinion on Keir Starmer is that he is not a communicator for this time. And when I say that, I simply mean that his skills are much best in Parliament. But, he is a QC type. He's a lawyer. He was a former director of public prosecutions. He would have been, my recent hot take on Starmer is that he would have been the perfect front bench minister for somebody really aggressive to use in Parliament. I don't think it works quite as well with him trying to sell that vision. And I watched him on Mar, where he was good for some parts of the interview. And then I have no idea who's advising him, but his team put him on with Brian Cox, who plays Logan Roy in Succession. And it was just
Professor Brian Cox, actually.
No, it was the actor, the great actor, and he just got destroyed for 5 minutes. And I think that sums up things rather well, in the sense that Starmer is not somebody who's got sort of the appeal and the cut through to energize and galvanize people, but he does have a chance of being prime minister if the government can lose the next election rather than him winning it. But through next year, it's got to be focused on an offer. It's got to be focused on a narrative, and it's also got to be focused on seeing some more other faces, I think.
Just briefly, I think the first time I came across Brian Cox was when he was playing, I think he was playing he was playing a Republican, or he was playing the father of a Republican. It was one of these kind of IRA type movies from the 80s that wasn't very good, but it was quite emotional. Blah, 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 blah. That's a very stubborn tangent to get to basically the protocol. Now, is Boris completely bluffing the EU on the protocol? It's just lingering on. I think there's a lot of fatigue in Northern Ireland, certainly a lot of fatigue in the South about it. What will happen with the protocol, and what does the UK even have to bargain with at this stage?
I imagine that Article 16 is more likely to be triggered than not. I think that there are a few reasons behind this. One being that the sort of distraction is probably going to be very handy at some point in the future.
I think that you're nail on the head there.
And we've already seen this, right? We've already seen major posturing from the UK going very aggressively after the EU, going very aggressively after France in particular, and setting up a narrative that the EU is trying to interfere with or manipulate Northern Ireland to its own ends, as it has done for time immemorial. They'll tell you. And they do this so that they can have a battle. It's good for riling up their base. It's good for reminding them why they're probably all in the same big camp. And then you have the inevitable business or reality-related drawback. They probably will try the same thing with Article 16, I would have thought. It will probably be really quite painful on both sides of the Irish Sea, and the fallout from it will just depend on who gets the blame for what. And it seems to be that still not enough Tory voters blame the government for the effects of Brexit to give a sort of seismic near or long-term shift for that. Triggering Article 16 would be a different matter. So that theory is unproven for that situation, but I think I wouldn't be at all surprised if we were sat here in 4 or 6 weeks discussing the ramifications of that.
Well, interesting times. That movie was The Boxer, by the way, if anyone can remember. And it was from the year, he was also in Braveheart, and it was from the year 97, so I thought it was actually older than that. What else have we got, William, on this beautiful day as you talk from the comfort of your house for once?
We're going to just quickly running through. We've got by-election odds up for both Old.
We do indeed. Now, I'm interested in this. So we've had a couple of surprises in recent by-elections, but the narrative's going to change here, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, first things first, these should be safe seats, even for a government midterm in difficulty. 2019 result for Owen Paterson had a majority of 22,000, nearly 23,000. Took 62.7% of the vote. Graham Carey ran for Labour. He lost 9%. So that's not a particularly close seat. You would think they'd hold it. There falls on to hold it. Helpful, I think, that it's not a recall by-election where Paterson would be standing. And it's also probably helpful for them that there's going to be, I think, candidates from Labour, the Lib Dems and the Green Party. But that said, interesting to watch that margin and to see if it's closer. And the Lib Dems are already apparently leafleting there. The fundamentals just aren't as good for them as they were in Cheshire and Amersham. They're just not as good. It's a more Leave area. People there are more culturally disposed, I think, to conservatism. But that said, I think it'd be very interesting to watch those results. And I think that's a far more risky by-election than it is for Old Bexley and Sidcup. The Conservatives are 12s on there. I don't think we've yet got candidates. I'll get back to you on that for next week. But this is, of course, in the light of the tragic passing of Sir James Brokenshire. And the Tories are 12s on to hold it. Labour 8s, Lib Dems 20s, Reform UK, the Richard Tice Party 33s.
Yeah, I'd actually suggest there are probably worse 12s on shots than that. But those taking the 4s on for the Paterson seat, maybe, would they have a little few jitters?
With Paterson, yeah, easily, because, I mean, locally, that story is going to have been magnified 1,000 times. And again, it's not just non-Tories who are upset at this. Everybody from the political spectrum appears to be upset. There are going to be a lot of people in that seat who will be extremely unimpressed at Paterson's behaviour, even if they may think that he deserves the right to replies or whatever. Much depends on the campaigning and on how long the story goes on for. We're on, I think it's day 7 of it. I don't think it's going to go anywhere soon. Parliament goes to recess, I think, from tomorrow. So it's possible that, you know, the government might avoid a few parliamentary shellackings, but this will be running, certainly. And at the very least, opposition parties will expect it to. The big thing here on a national level is whether the Tory press keep running with it. But given the amount of material there is out there, I hardly think we've heard the last of this.
And we haven't heard the last of the polling station either. William, we'll be back next week.
We shall be back next week, and I look forward to it.
That was the polling station with Johnny Ward and William Kedjanyi. Check out the website, Star Sports website, for all the latest odds. A couple of very short price favourites in those by-elections, but maybe it might be more prudent to look longer term and take a position on where things are going with the Conservatives and Labour. We'll be back next week.